Well, today was unexpectedly pretty damn exciting. We just got a new cinematic, a big, delicious 6-minute one. Hell, it's even full CG, big budget stuff. It's as if Blizzard were aware that this would be a surprise because they dropped the damn thing at 5 in the morning. Old Soldier follows Varrock Saurfang in the moments before the battle for Lordaeron, but more importantly, it brings us back to the burning of Teldrassil from his perspective and a scene with his dead son. Not only is this a visually striking cinematic, it's also entirely concerned with character work, and any doubt about Saurfang is laid to rest here. And just to show my hand here, this is basically one of my favorite Blizzard cinematics ever, and of course it does come off the controversial Sylvanas Warbringers episode, which, to my disappointment, did reinforce a potential fork in Sylvanas' character, her essentially being pure evil, but I suppose in a world that otherwise can still be great. I did think that doing that was at the expense of her being a more interesting, deep, complex character, and I think she's now utterly boring. However, what this cinematic shows is a good counterpoint to her. It shows us who I think will be the next war chief, or at the very least, the orc who will install the next war chief on the throne. And of course, I'm doing this with the expectation that you've watched the cinematic, so if not, why the hell are you looking at my mug? Go watch it right now. Okay, right, with that said, it's analysis time. Now, first up, the burning of Teldrassil shots here are absolutely gorgeous. I am amazed that Blizzard decided to tackle Teldrassil in this way, because making these scenes is really expensive. Now, making shots within a scene, that really isn't that expensive. You're just moving a virtual camera about the place. Okay, bit of a simplification, but the point is that they've put in a lot of upfront work to make this dark shore beach scene. For only a few seconds of footage, honestly, I would not be surprised if we saw more of that. But narratively, of course, this is such an important moment because, first of all, we get a glimpse of burning civilians, the horror of what Sylvanas has inflicted, and almost certainly reminds Saurfang of one of his most shameful moments back on Draenor when he was involved in the Draenei genocide. Crazed under the influence of demon blood, he remembers enjoying it, but that's a memory that has haunted him ever since. So seeing stuff like that again, that is some genuine post-traumatic stress disorder material for him. Just look at his face, like that is pure rage, and this time demon blood has nothing to do with it. Sylvanas' actions are an affront to all of the Horde ideals in Saurfang's mind, and this is the same Saurfang who just earlier was making sure to take civilians, safely at Lordaeron. So he even tries to stop the catapults, but it's no use. The deaths of likely many thousands of civilians are unavoidable here. And it's pretty clear to me that this is when Saurfang loses hope in the Horde, and he no longer feels part of them. And this scene clearly establishes Sylvanas as being the current direction of the Horde, and Saurfang being the old direction. And as we see, this causes him to lose hope. That's exactly what Sylvanas wanted to do with the Night Elves. Remember that Saurfang's attachment to her army brings her so much credence with the older members of the Horde. He's extremely vital to her leadership working. And of course, what happens? Well, Saurfang correctly predicts what Sylvanas' actions will do. It will unify the Alliance against them. Now, of course, time passes, the prediction's absolutely correct, because he now stands on the walls of Lordaeron City as a massive Alliance army is in the distance, ready to attack at first light. And Zappy Boy is also up, walking around the walls. It's his first battle, he's young, he's nervous, Saurfang isn't talkative, and he doesn't have anything inspiring to say. The big hulking old orc that we see there is just a husk. Saurfang is caught up in his own thoughts, he's thinking of his son's death. And while he may not right now be the most well-rounded person, and he maybe has wanted death for a while, he used to have a family. That ended with the death of his son at the Wrathgate, and that's a memory that he continually thinks back to. He at least takes solace in how his son died an honourable death against a true enemy, but he also no doubt remembers how the Alliance, on that day, were honourable, they fought with him, and later on they let Saurfang take his son's corpse home. He now finds himself fighting for an honourless side in his view, the side that killed his son, and what's even worse, he finds himself fighting an enemy who he regards as being honourable. So it's no wonder that he snaps at Zappy Boy whenever Zappy Boy starts talking about honor and glory. Saurfang's been long enough to see past those short-term things and really see the bigger picture. Through his life, he has fought through all sorts of causes, both honorable and honorless, so suffice to say he sees the foolishness of the young in this case. Now, at this stage, he just wants to die. He wants an honorable death. And I think that after Draenor, he's just always wanted to prove himself, to redeem his honor. Not necessarily to atone for what he did, but more to be worthy of his ancestors, which is a large part of Warcraft Orcish culture. Nothing shows Saurfang's utter despair more than whenever he casts his pendant into the nearby fire. That entirely symbolizes that at that point he is done with the Horde, and as we soon see, he's just done in general. So he takes to the battlefield, walking towards Alliance forces. He's taking off his armor, his Horde pendant, they're all gone. Saurfang attempts to walk away one last time towards what he, in his moment of weakness, sees as a good death.
Oh, give up, boy.
Like you? Live another day.
But the young and plucky Zappy Boy catches up. Oh dear sweet Zappy Boy, the accidental savior of the true Horde, as we'll find out. He tries to get Saurfang to come back, and Saurfang is just having none of it. And as much as these words anger Saurfang, and this youngling has no idea how bad things get, but ultimately Zappy Boy is right. Saurfang is running away from it all. Even someone as strong as him can barely deal with how bad things were and how, from his perspective, just how bad they're going to get. But finally, he does see a way. And there you go. This is such a good cinematic. Zappy Boy says, live another day, echoing Saurfang's words from earlier. Saurfang accepts his pendant, jokes that they're going to need armor if they're not going to die, and, well, damn, your boy's back. And over the duration of this cinematic, you see him at his darkest point and then pretty much be reborn anew. A character was ready to move forward on the new path in this expansion. So let's do opinions, and the first one is a bit more about Sylvanas, because Sylvanas is obviously a sociopathic character. Now, whether she was a sociopath before, hard to know, but certainly after death, the effects of death in the Warcraft universe do amplify some aspects of one's character and pretty much quash others. Now, the thing is, good sociopaths struggle early on in their lives because they're not socialized, but once they're socialized, they understand social cues, how people work, how emotions work. Even if they don't have those emotions or feel them as strongly or whatever, they're able to manipulate them. But the thing that sets Sylvanas apart from an effective sociopath, say, I don't know, maybe a Hannibal Lecter or a Frank Underwood or, something like that, what sets her apart is that she fundamentally cannot understand some aspects of the people who are living. And this is shown completely clearly in her perspective on hope, and how that is somewhat counteracted by Saurfang. So what Sylvanas does is she tries to destroy hope with the Night Elves. What she actually does is she destroys Saurfang's hope, and she inspires hope in the Night Elves. She does the exact opposite of what her stated intent was. That's because she doesn't really understand how people work, at least the living, now that she has spent such a long time being dead. And while that does cause despair and darkness for Saurfang, eventually he is able to pull back from perhaps his darkest point and be a truly inspired character. Now, of course, that is something that you see in the Battle for Lordaeron main cinematic. However, the events of the Battle for Lordaeron, they change things up. I'm going to talk about those later, but I'll clearly signpost it in case you, haven't been caught up on the spoilers. But I think that's an interesting commentary on Sylvanas as a character, the contrast between her and Saurfang, and what that really means for the Horde. I think fundamentally, Sylvanas cannot lead living beings because she just doesn't understand them. Saurfang, because he had a wife, he had kids, he had his brother who died, he knows what it, is to have loved and then lost, which means that he can understand the Night Elves, he could empathize with them, but Sylvanas is unable to do that. Therefore, she's not particularly effective, and that's going to put her on a very divergent path to the mainline Horde, especially now that she is ostracizing her most probably politically most important ally. Now, it's worth mentioning the novellas. They have came out because some collector's editions have been seeded to YouTubers and stuff. I may have one, but my shipping address with Blizzard is not where I live. It's like the family home, so I don't know yet. But in those novellas, basically they flesh out the narrative that currently exists. And I'll just say this much on that point. Does it change my core problems with some of what Sylvanas does? Not necessarily, but it does flesh the narrative out a little bit more, and that is definitely a good thing. Now, I do have a lot more lore that I want to talk about, but I want to avoid the sort of post where we are right now spoilers until later on in the video, because I want that to be an optional thing. So, the final non-spoiler thing that I'm going to talk about is the inherent downsides of a transmedia narrative. So, what is a transmedia narrative? Basically, it is, you've got your game and its story. You have maybe some comics that come out. You've got, the whole 9 yards. Cinematics, comics, novellas, little short stories. And it's the idea of weaving one grand narrative through multiple different mediums. And it's really tricky to do right because in the case of World of Warcraft, and this is something that's really hit a lot of game genres. Actually, to divorce it from World of Warcraft for a second, I'm going to bring up Halo. Now, before you all click off, basically, Halo had a very simple narrative for its first 3 games, and it was supported by some books, and they gave you good context to the story, but you didn't need them. However, Halo 4, with a new developer team, was built with, basically, to understand and appreciate the story of Halo 4, you needed to read a novel to understand things, and that meant that its narrative was a dud for many people. Same goes for Halo 5. Gears of War had this a lot with Gears of War 3, where, and I've not actually played that game, but from my friends who are into it, who are also writers, like playwright guys, Gears 3 had this problem where it really relied on a book as well, and that meant that the actual in-game story was either pretty weak or had a lot of emotional beats that one would otherwise miss if they hadn't read the book. So in the case of this, what we have to consider is the experience of a player who is just playing World of Warcraft, the game itself, without knowing anything else. To those people, it's extremely confusing because they're going to see the Sylvanas thing in-game, and assuming the Saurfang thing is not in-game, then, well, okay, first of all, I hope Blizzard maybe have that played before the Battle for Lordaeron. I think that would be fantastic. But because right now it's not in-game and you have to find it in an external source, that means a lot of people are going to miss out on that. So that's a broad issue between the comics, everything. Lots of people, there's going to be a high attrition rate essentially when it comes to plot points. And that's going to, if you take, let's just say 10 million people, right, who start Battle for Azeroth, over time it will go like this, with that sort of being the amount of people who understand the narrative just decreases and decreases because more and more transmedia narrative stuff is required for it to be understood. And that's kind of tricky. There is another issue with transmedia narratives that I want to bring up, and that is the issue of immersion. So you have to experience these stories in multiple different platforms. And what that means is that you basically have to break the immersion of being within an experience to get that narrative, which is really tricky. It just naturally takes people out. Now, that is an inherent problem with MMO storytelling, and while I could sit here and maybe say, what if the cutscenes from Uncharted 4 were posted on the Naughty Dog YouTube channel? That wouldn't be fair because they are different games and different genres, and I absolutely empathize with Blizzard that it's extremely hard to do a compelling narrative in an MMO. That said, people tell me Final Fantasy XIV does it well, so it's kind of tricky to know. The final thing that I'll say with transmedia narrative stuff is that sometimes characterizations can change between mediums. So if you compare the characters of, say, Game of Thrones TV to Game of Thrones book, where one of them is point of view chapters, but the other one is not, characters actually seem very different, and that's one thing that does make the characterization of everyone a little bit tricky to do when it comes to doing a transmedia narrative in a game. And then before I kick it into spoilers, I just, overall want to say this is a fucking beautiful cinematic. Holy shit. It's just gorgeous. I'm basically, what I tweeted about this was, it is great to see Blizzard, because Blizzard always talk about how they want to craft epic moments, and whenever they do that, it's like whenever I heard one of the Fallout writers say that their themes were androids and suspicion. They're not themes. But I hear Blizzard talk about, we want to craft epic moments. And I'm like, okay, an epic moment's great for a few minutes, but it's not deep, it's not meaningful. It's like popcorn. This was a cinematic that was entirely focused on characters. They didn't need much of a big epic moment because the character drama was able to carry it. That along with some absolutely wonderful music. So it's just lovely to see them do that. I hope we see more of it in the future. This is, I cannot overstate how welcome and surprising the quality of the narrative and the writing was here. And one thing that Connell, who edits on the channel, not this video, but a few other, well, most of the other ones, I think this one I'm going to quickly do after I record it, but he pointed out that the writing kind of feels like those epilogue cinematics. And I think that was a very good point, because those Legion epilogue cinematics really, the characters felt a lot more different when they were talking than they normally do. So I've got to wonder if there was any similarities between teams or people taking inspiration from each other. That said, it's also very hard to know what the exact, production times for all of this stuff was. But the point is, beautiful work. I'm really happy with it. Well done. Okay, right. It's time to enter Spoiler Town, because we're going to be talking about the future leader of the Horde. Oh yeah, this is a good one. Right, so Sylvanas is not going to be there for long, potentially. Hard to know exactly. There's a few different ways they can go with this. First of all, and of course this is Spoiler Town, so Saurfang ends this, raising his arms up, being all like, wow, I'm gonna do a big fight, woohoo, hype. And that carries forward into a lot of the battle for Lordaeron, and then all of his hope is dashed, because Sylvanas uses biological weapons in a way that is more of an affront than previously. I think Saurfang would have a big issue with it being used anyway. Of course, Garrosh did, and Saurfang was never really that exposed to the campaign in Gilneas, though of course he did see a lot of other stuff, with Blight and the Wrathgate and his son, obviously. So actually, yeah, that's the first thing. His son, Blight, very linked. Okay, the Blight didn't kill him, but the Blight was a major part of the Wrathgate. But her using that, she used that to kill Alliance soldiers. She also killed loads of her own soldiers, and then she raised them from the dead. That just shows that, Saurfang will see an orc, he will see that orc die, and he will think, well, that orc died an honorable death. But if he then sees that body being desecrated, to him, that is going to be one of the highest insults to life, or, insults to that sort of deceased person. So she does that, and he is not having it, and he tries to bring some of this up, and then she goads him about his son, which, as we saw in this cinematic, that is not a place you want to go with Saurfang. So he goes AWOL. He basically does go back to a very dark place. The high that we see at the end of the cinematic is shortly lived, and I think that's maybe a part of the tragedy that Blizzard want to show with it. Sylvanas ultimately does sort of beat him down again in terms of his mental state, and he does want to die because he basically tries to take on the entire Alliance party in what will almost certainly be suicidal, but then Anduin decides to spare him because Anduin is honorable, which again ties into what I talked about earlier about Saurfang respecting honor, and he sees himself as fighting an honorable foe, and that he is on the honorless side. Now, later on in beta, later on in the Horde intro scenario, we see that Saurfang is locked up in the stockades, and they have changed this, but initially, he basically walks out, he says, I will have words with your king, and he goes to talk to Anduin. So I'm pretty sure what's going to happen is that Saurfang wants to start a Horde, start the Horde again. He wants to maybe oust Sylvanas or something like that. And I think he might want to go to Anduin and say, you're honorable, I'm honorable, you agree this is a pointless battle, I agree this is a pointless battle, how about we come together and create, essentially, a viable long-term two-state solution. I'm thinking that that's going to be his goal. However, it's World of Warcraft. Something is bound to happen, and one interesting point that's been brought up to me is, what if that is where these characters go directly after, but the Alliance then commits its own crime at some point, maybe in a future patch? Could be Gen, could even be Anduin, but what if they commit a crime that is so great that even Saurfang is soured in the Alliance, and maybe he ends up having it proven to him that, shit, maybe Sylvanas was right. Not saying that'll happen, but maybe some permutation of that will happen, and I think that is the morally grey possibility space. I suppose the initial reason why I was a bit disappointed with the Sylvanas stuff was I thought that she had the potential to be an interesting character, especially with her Legion narrative, and she always seemed cold and calculating and emotionally detached, and a lot of that sort of evaporated, plus there was just some what I would consider to be plot holes in the writing. So it's taking a lot of the possibility space away from where she will go, but I think there are very interesting things going on with Saurfang. I think there's a good chance he could be the next war chief, and that would certainly be very interesting for Horde players. Yeah, I mean, damn, he could also try to install someone else. Maybe Thrall will come back. Thrall's been basically missing on beta, which is odd because much like how Sylvanas' broad narrative was teased with Legion, they teased the narrative with Thrall and Vol'jin's Urn, and that has just not happened on beta, so maybe that's a future patch or something. There's definitely interesting stuff afoot. This cinematic, it doesn't actually have that much to break down, it's just some beautiful character moments that are worth highlighting and giving context for and maybe trying to extrapolate into the future. But overall, what a tremendous bit of work. I'm so damn happy that they made that. Some people were saying that this was totally reactionary to the Sylvanas thing. That's not how production works. This would have taken a long time to make. Although it was followed up to me that it could be that maybe they had this in the can for later on, and they decided to release it a little bit earlier to counteract some stuff. Now, that is just the case of uploading something to YouTube and sort of doing the internal routing for a broad social media campaign, and that definitely is possible to do in a 1 to 2 day timeline. So, there you go. That's my thoughts on this absolutely wonderful cinematic that beefs out one of the more, I'd say right now, more interesting Horde characters that we have to deal with. I'm dead interested to see where this narrative goes. So yeah, I hope you're excited. I think it's pretty damn cool. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.